The sun had now not yet risen above the historic skyline of Rome, however inside the hearts of many in the Catholic Church, there was already a quiet anticipation. The 2025 conclave become in contrast to any in latest reminiscence. With the passing of Pope Francis, the equerry of Peter stood simply empty, no longer just symbolically, however spiritually. In that sacred vacancy, eyes around the arena turned closer to one man who many believed were organized for this second through each divine providence and many years of faithful provider. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. To the ones inside and past Vatican partitions, Tagle became greater than simply some other cardinal. He became seen as a shepherd with the coronary heart of a father, a theologian with the voice of a storyteller, and a servant whose humility echoed the simplicity of St. Francis himself. Nicknamed the Asian Francis with the aid of many, Tagle had long been admired for his gentleness, pastoral intensity, and international vision. In an era while the Church desperately sought bridges over partitions, many felt he became the bridge the Church needed. Inside the months leading as much as the conclave, speculation changed into abundant, and in a few corners, it became unstated reality. Tagle is the herbal successor, whispered newshounds, bishops, or even a few cardinals. His name seemed constantly on the top of each speculative listing. He had already served as prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, and his tenure became marked via sincerity, global empathy, and an ardor for the gospel that reached past borders. In many approaches, he represented the colorful soul of the global South. And in a church increasingly more described by using that hemisphere, he appeared destined to ascend. But destiny has its personal rhythm within the corridors of the Vatican. Because the cardinals accrued in the Sistine Chapel, the sector watched with bated breath. Pilgrims lit candles, bishops offered loads, and newshounds covered up outside St. Peter's Square, rehearsing terms like the first Asian pope and preparing testimonies of ways a humble Filipino cardinal would now deliver the keys of Peter. Yet inside those sacred partitions, something surprising commenced to unfold. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, an enormously quiet and contemplative discern from America with deep missionary enjoy in Peru, started out to acquire guide. Few had spoken his name aloud in the lead-up. Fewer nevertheless had located him a number of the top contenders. And yet, because the ballots have been forged and recast, something shifted. A few called it a surprise, others a shock. But for those who recognized the mysterious paintings of the Holy Spirit, it was a sacred movement no headline ought to capture. The instant got here with a hush. The be counted had crossed the 2/3 threshold. A name echoed in the silence. Robert Francis Prevost, the man who had once served quietly the various bad in Peru, who had lived the Augustinian charism with intensity and dignity, changed into now chosen to emerge as Pope Leo XIV. For the sector outside, it turned into beautiful. For Cardinal Tagle, it changed into something greater profound. He did now not recoil, nor did his face betray disappointment. For individuals who noticed him seated near Prevost in the conclave, they would later say there was a peace in his expression, a silent prayer whispered not together with his lips, however along with his coronary heart. He looked at his pal, now elected to the highest non-secular workplace on the planet, and saw now not ambition fulfilled, but a sacred burden typical. And in that moment, Tagle knew that grace had spoken. The media, of direction, reacted with fervor. Headlines wondered how the expected one had not been chosen. Commentators dissected each element of the conclave, looking for politics and divisions. But individuals who knew the inner workings of the Spirit understood something deeper changed into at play. Tagle extra than absolutely everyone understood. He had never sought the papacy. From the day he became extended to cardinal through Pope Benedict XVI in 2012, he had shown no desire for prominence. In every interview, every homily, every pastoral stumble upon, he emphasized the gospel, no longer himself. When humans speculated that he will be pope, he could smile with that same childlike humility that had made him so loved and gently modified the challenge. What made Tagle expected was not his desire, but his witness. And in that, Possibly he changed into in no way more like Peter than on the very second he did no longer obtain the keys. The days after the conclave exceeded in a blur of ceremonies, celebrations, and media frenzy. Pope Leo XIV, now vested in white, emerged on the balcony with a quiet electricity and deep reverence. His first words as Pope have been not grand or thunderous. They have been soft, prayerful, human. In them, many started out to feel the purpose for his election. Cardinal Tagle, in the meantime, kept to his role. He regarded at official functions, provided his congratulations, and spoke warmly about the new Holy Father. However, those who had visible him and Prevost collectively over time knew this changed into extra than political courtesy. It changed into fraternal love. Their friendship had grown over the years in Rome, solid not in grand speeches, but in quiet coffees and moments of mutual agree with. That they had labored facet via facet, Tagle in evangelization, put up in episcopal appointments. Their vocations have been extraordinary, however their hearts beat for the equal venture to serve Christ's Church with faithfulness and joy. And now one would function Pope and the alternative as a companion on the journey, a guide, a brother, a witness. Dart Tagle often spoke of how the Church is not a stage for non-public ambition, but a dwelling frame formed by using grace and moved by the Spirit. He believed that proper leadership became in no way taken. It changed into obtained in trembling humility earlier than the altar of God. And in Pope Leo XIV, he diagnosed that humility because the bells of St. Peter's tolled and the world absorbed the information of a new pope. Cardinal Tagle knelt quietly in his non-public chapel. On my own, not with regret, however with gratitude. He prayed not to be observed but to be trustworthy. And in that prayer he remained, nonetheless the expected one, not to wear the crown, however to carry the cross beside any other. The arena had its pope. However the Church had something even more treasured. Two men once seated facet by means of facet within the sign chapel, now taking walks forward, on the second day of the conclave, the smoke modified shade. A pant rippled through the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square. The white smoke, fumata bianca, rose into the Roman sky, signaling that a new pope had been elected. The bells commenced to toll. Human beings wept. Newshounds scrambled. Speculators rushed to fill the gap between mystery and know-how. And nonetheless inside the Vatican, the name had no longer yet been spoken publicly. However, amongst the ones present in the sign chapel, the name had echoed like thunder in a whisper. Robert Francis Prevost. To many it changed into a wonder. To others a surprise. To Maximum an entire mystery. Cardinal Prevost had now not appeared at the media's brief lists. His call became slightly mentioned in pre-conclave insurance. There had been no public ground swell, no bold declarations of assist. He became known inside positive circles, sure, as a quiet and committed servant of the Church. He had earned the respect of his peers. He had led the dicastery for bishops with discretion and area. He had spent years as a missionary in Peru, however a probable pope. Almost no one had said so. Yet, it became exactly that lack of attention that allowed the Spirit to move freely. In the chapel, as ballots were counted and names tallied, Prevost's help had grown step by step, all of sudden. He hadn't campaigned. He hadn't made his presence loud or his intentions clear. He genuinely prayed, listened, and engaged quietly together with his brothers in purple. It changed into, as several cardinals later stated, the Holy Spirit acting through the very heart of humility. And because the final votes have been studied aloud, TUF3S had chosen him. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost would be the next successor of Peter. He prevalent the choice with a trembling nod, his eyes downcast in silent awe. He chose the call Leo, Pope Leo XIV, reviving a call that had not been used for over a century, a call of power, a call of legacy. Because the information changed into announced to the arena with the timeless word Habemus Papam, Cardinal Tagle stood quietly only some feet away. He had regarded the moment changed into coming before the final count had even ended. He had felt it deep inside his soul, like a quiet voice confirming what human calculations couldn't. And he smiled, now not the pressured smile of a man pretending to be at peace, but the gentle, holy smile of someone who recognizes that God had spoken. Tagle had not lost something due to the fact he had by no means been in search of anything. His heart shaped inside the crucible of religion and provider should simplest respond with a prayer of thanksgiving. But the global out-of-doors took longer to system. News headlines flooded in. Dark horse will become pope. Sudden American chosen. Why Tagle changed into surpassed over. There has been speculation, evaluation, even confusion. Reporters tried to create a narrative that would explain what had came about, seeking to paint political traces where there were none. But this wasn't politics. This became windfall. For folks that knew each guys, Tagle and Prevost, the choice was not so mysterious. Those were guys reduced from the same religious fabric. Each had lived many of the negative. Both had served beyond their native lands. Each had walked through the corridors of Vatican paperwork at the same time as preserving their souls anchored in pastoral reality. And both had an unshakable reverence for the thriller of the Church and the mercy of Christ. Tagle particularly was prepared for this second, no longer to upward push, however to help. In non-public, he had continually insisted that becoming pope changed into not a prize, to be received, but a pass to be embraced. And if the Lord had chosen any other to carry that cross, then his task became to lift it with him in prayer and fraternity. The day after the announcement, the Vatican buzzed with preparations. Crowds stuffed the rectangular, flags waved, hymns soared. But internal a small chapel tucked away inside the apostolic palace. Cardinal Tagle knelt by myself earlier than the Blessed Sacrament. The applause outside did not contact him there. Only the quiet voice of God. Use me, he whispered. No longer lengthy after a personal audience turned into organized. The newly elected Pope Leo XIV requested to peer his vintage friend, no longer in ceremony, but in silence. Behind the heavy doorways of the papal residences, some distance from the cameras and fanfare, the two guys embraced. No phrases had been wanted. Their journey together, which had taken them from Manila to Lima to Rome, had now reached a new chapter, one wherein Tagle could stay a brother, a accomplice, and a counselor, although by no means formally topped. Pope Leo spoke humbly as he constantly did. The Lord has requested greater of me than I concept he could, he said quietly. Tagle nodded. Then let us stroll it together. The communication endured softly and slowly, drifting through reminiscences of past missions, theological debates, and the quiet joy of their paintings in Rome. They shared laughter, concern, wish. There has been no resentment, no awkwardness, best deep affection and mutual expertise. It became now not contention that had defined them, but reverence. And so, as the sector outside endured to digest the occasions, the guys internal understood them already. The Spirit had moved. A new pope had been selected, and the Church had now not turned its return on Tagle. On the contrary, he now stood even extra visibly as a pillar of unity and electricity. He might play an essential function in the transition, now not due to any name or mandate, but because of who he changed into, a person of deep listening, gentle suggest, and unwavering religion. He had usually served inside the shadows, not looking for the mild, and yet it usually regarded to locate him. Inside the coming days, his call would appear once more, not as a pope opt for, however as the one who could place the fisherman's ring on the brand new Holy Father's finger. That historical image of the papal workplace surpassed from one successor of Peter to the following would be entrusted to Tagle's fingers. And in that sacred act, the arena might see something even extra than a coronation. They would see fidelity, humility, grace. For now, even though, he walked the quiet halls of the Vatican with a non-violent smile and a prayer on his lips. That they had labored in tandem on more activities than they may rely. Tagle had a heart for the margins. Publish had a mind for discerning shepherds. Their conversations often went past due into the night, sitting in modest Vatican rooms over tea and dry biscuits, speak me no longer of strength or influence, however of people, clergymen, households, migrants, teens, missionaries, souls they each loved deeply. I recall when we first started out seeing each different regularly in Rome, Tagle once recalled to a small group of workers. I had heard of Robert's time in Peru, but I hadn't expected him to carry it with such quiet authority. He did not communicate of it frequently, however you may tell he left part of his heart there. Submit had arrived in Peru a long time in advance as a younger Augustinian missionary. He lived in far-flung regions, a long way from air-con and secure beds, immersed inside the language and sufferings of the human beings. He wasn't a journeying prelate losing in for photos. He had stayed, persevered, found out. While he backed to the United States later in life, he carried Peru with him. Like a second place of origin stitched into his priesthood, Tagle too had walked a special path. As the Archbishop of Manila, he had become considered one of Asia's maximum visible church leaders, but his fame by no means altered his simplicity. He often rode jeeps rather than private motors and spoke to vendors with the identical warm temperature he presented to dignitaries. When he moved to Rome, he added that identical pastoral electricity with him, a disarming smile and a heart always leaning in the direction of the poor. The synergy among the two became not born from comparable careers, but from shared vision. While the forms around them on occasion churned with tensions and ambition, Tagle and Faust quietly built a partnership rooted in constancy. They respected each other, trusted one another, and possibly most significantly, they diagnosed some things sacred within the different, a man now not chasing rank, however bearing the weight of love. Inside the conferences, when tensions might upward push and debates could veer into posturing, the presence of both guys had a relaxing effect. Tagle had a manner of disarming arguments with laughter or with a gentle phrase from the gospel. Faust, greater reserved, listened carefully, talking best whilst he had thought deeply sufficient to add something of substance. Their distinctive personalities complemented every different. Tagle added lightness. Prevost intensity. Tagle requested questions that pointed to people's hearts. Prevost raised questions that invited mirrored image and prayer. Collectively they fashioned a stability, a quiet counterpoint to louder voices. It turned into this harmony that made their presence inside the 2025 conclave so incredible. As the cardinals filed into the Sistine Chapel on the primary day, few ought to leave out the sight of Tagle and put up strolling facet by using facet. There was no symbolism meant. Yet there it was a sign of the Church's universality and a silent testimony to a shared assignment born no longer of politics but of pastoral devotion. The days main to the election were cloaked in confidentiality, however individuals who watched closely observed something diffused. When cardinals mentioned the challenges of the Church, Faust listened with an attentiveness that became nearly monastic. Whilst asked his opinion, he responded now not with grand gestures, but with measured hope. Tagle regularly sat nearby, supplying his own reflections with humility and expertise. Although many had expected Tagle could be chosen, he in no way acted as a man looking forward to a crown. He spoke as he usually had, with gentleness and conviction. He prayed within the quiet corners of the chapel, often by way of the photo of the Ultimate Judgment on Michelangelo's altar wall. There, underneath the dramatic portrayal of Christ's return, Tagle can be visible with eyes closed, palms folded, not soliciting for victory, however for grace. Whilst the very last vote changed into forged, and Prevost became elected, nobody in the chapel moved faster than Tagle. He became many of the first to embody him. The two guys shared a moment that numerous cardinals would later describe as profound. A quick appearance, a whispered blessing, a hand positioned over the coronary heart. There has been no hint of unhappiness, simplest pleasure rooted in the recognition that the Spirit had spoken. Inside the days that observed, their bond grew even more potent. While others provided formal congratulations, Tagle sat with the brand new Pope in moments of silence and recommend. Pope Leo XIV frequently became to him no longer due to the fact he needed to, however, because he wanted to. He needed the voice of someone who understood the Church's wounds and hopes, a person who had walked the identical roads and listened to the same silences. They were now on one-of-a-kind paths, one getting into the worldwide spotlight as Pope, the opposite returning to serve quietly from within. But the adventure turned into nonetheless one. Their destination turned into now not electricity however holiness. And their shared assignment as continually changed into to carry Christ to the sector through mercy, humility, and religion. Looking back, it changed into in no way about which one could upward thrust. It changed into usually about who would serve. And now each were prepared. The halls of the Vatican, with their marble columns and echoing footsteps, have heard many voices, a few commanding, a few elegant, and a few loud enough to make the walls vibrate. However, not all leaders improve their voices to be heard. Some are listened to because of the load in their silence, because of the quiet power that radiates no longer from extent, however from presence. Pope Leo XIV turning into this sort of chief. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle had seen many sorts of authority in his years of service. He had discovered prelates who led with iron firmness, others who inspired through intellectual brilliance, and nonetheless others whose charisma drew crowds like a magnet. However, with Pope Leo XIV, previously Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, there was something distinctive, almost countercultural within the global of Vatican management. He did not dominate a room when he entered. He did not are searching for the spotlight. Instead, he offered something the Church had perhaps longed for in silence, a shepherd who leads through listening. From their years working collectively in Rome, Tagle had already formed a photo of Robert Prevost. Others feared a lack of decisiveness. However, Cardinal Tagle saw something else. He saw awareness. He leads like Christ did. Tagle advised a collection of missionaries touring from the Philippines. Not shouting from rooftops, but walking beside the people, asking, "Who do you assert that I'm?" That's the form of leadership that builds belief, gradual, humble, and enduring. Tagle's phrases weren't flattery. He had discovered the equal features in Prevost long before his election. In their many interactions, Tagle had seen how deeply rooted past selections were. Nothing impulsive, nothing done to delight others. He wasn't afraid to wait, to hope, and to consult those round him before performing. Throughout a particularly hard moment within the dicastery for bishops while a proposed candidate for an important diocese sparked division, Prevost were beneath stress to make a brief desire. Bishops had been ready, expectancies have been mounting. The media become already murmuring but he selected to put off. "I have not prayed enough about this," he said quietly during one assembly, his eyes regular. Per weeks are passed, then some other, and sooner or later, after days of silent discernment, he back, no longer with a grand assertion, however with clarity. He had selected a person distinctive, someone nobody had predicted, but in the end it was the right decision. The bishop became welcomed with joy, and the diocese, once divided, observed new existence. "It is who he's," Tagle might later say. He would not act till he knows it is now not simply him making the selection. He waits till it is God. That approach failed to change with the white cassack. In truth, if something, it deepened in his early days as Pope Leo XIV. He obtained heaps of messages, requests for appointments, appeals for movement, cries for renewal. But instead of drowning them, he laid them quite literally before the tabernacle. One of the Swiss guards confided later to a chum that on more than one nights he saw the brand new Pope kneeling on my own within the chapel lengthy after midnight, protecting nothing however a few sheets of paper and a rosary. He turned into no longer ignoring the world. He became sporting it. Tagle had spoken to him privately throughout the one's days, encouraging him to withstand the temptation to perform. "Let them misunderstand," he had said gently. "Let them wonder. The Spirit will answer in time." And it was now not that Pope Leo lacked the ability to talk boldly. On the opposite, when he did speak, his words carried the full weight of an existence spent in the discipline. He did now not theorize approximately the bad. He had eaten with them. He did no longer speculate on missionary work. He had lived it, sweating beneath the equal solar, on foot the identical muddy roads. One tale that resurfaced amongst those who knew him in Peru referred to a time whilst he visited a village reduced off by using rains and landslides. The people had no longer visible a priest in months. While he arrived, he carried now not just the Eucharist, however, sacks of rice and medicinal drug. That night, he slept on the floor of a hut, his only pillow, a folded towel. No press, no declaration, simply offers. Tagle remembered memories like that when watching Pope Leo navigate his early papacy. There was energy in the back of the softness, steel under the simplicity. I assume he sees management now not as path, Tagle mused one night with a visiting institution of seminarians, but as accompaniment. He's now not trying to drag the church to his facet. He is trying to stroll with it. That photograph of a leader on foot instead of commanding became extra brilliant as the days opened up. Pope Leo XIV began assembly with bishops from numerous continents, no longer for reports, but for communique. He asked questions, listened extra than he spoke. He didn't arrive with a plan, but left with a coronary heart full of expertise. Cardinal Tagle became gift at lots of the one's periods. Sometimes he said little, different times he offered a story or a parable. However, what he saw over and over turned into how Leo's silence drew humans in, how his humility made room for others to talk, and the way his restraint gave birth to know-how. There is a form of electricity that does not are looking for reputation, a sort of authority that does not call for obedience, but earns it through consider. Pope Leo XIV in those early days was slowly revealing himself to be that sort of chief, and the Church, so often starved for authenticity, changed into beginning to word. The instant got here, no longer with fanfare or trumpets, however, with a plume of white smoke that curled gracefully into the Roman sky. It turned into as though heaven had exhaled, and the arena stood nevertheless to concentrate. St. Peter's Square erupted in cheers. Bells rang out from the basilica and those wept openly. From Rome to Manila, from Lima to Chicago, 1 billion hearts waited for the call that might comply with the historical words Habemus Papam. Within the Sign Chapel, there was no celebration but, most effective silence, reverent, and thick with awe. The cardinals remained seated, their pink robes a sea of scarlet underneath Michelangelo's Last Judgment. The ballots had been cast, the selection made. Cardinal Robert Francis Post had reached the vital 2/3 majority. The person who had lived many of the poor in Peru, who had never sought electricity, now sat quietly among his brothers, his lifestyles approximately to alternate all the time. Cardinal Tagle become only a few seats away whilst it passed off. He were watching, now not with ambition or tension, however with prayer. All through the deliberations he had sensed a shift, something subtle within the manner the conversations had opened up, the manner the ballots had trended. Whilst the very last relay became red, he closed his eyes for a short second, not in disappointment, however in surrender. He looked at Previs, now Pope-elect Pope Leo XIV, and noticed something in his pal's face that moved him deeply. It wasn't joy, now not inside the manner the sector defines it. It wasn't fear, both. It becomes something holier, a type of sacred stillness, as though the soul had heard a voice it could not deny. There has been a moderate tremor in Post's respiration, a flicker in his eyes that found out the immensity of what had just took place. Among the anxious smile and the gradual, deep breath, Tagle noticed what he later described as a mixture of holy resignation and holy fear. It wasn't the look of a person who had. Cardinals rose to their toes surrounding Post, presenting congratulations, embraces, advantages. And whilst Tagle subsequently stood, he failed to simply provide a proper gesture. He positioned his hand gently on Publish's shoulder, leaned in, and whispered, something best the two of them heard. The ones close by saw Leo's eyes mist over. It wasn't the start of a papacy. It changed into the continuation of a friendship sanctified by using the Spirit. Later, as the newly elected Pope retired in brief to the room of tears to sunrise the white cassock, Tagle remained within the chapel. He regarded up at Michelangelo's Christ, his arm raised in judgment, surrounded by using saints and martyrs. Such a lot of before him had made this adventure. So many had walked out of this chapel bearing the load of Peter's mantle. But now it turned into his friend who could do so. And it turned into time to pray, no longer as a cardinal praying for a pope, however as a brother praying for his brother. While Pope Leo XIV emerged on the balcony before the arena, the load of the instant become nearly too much to position into phrases. He appeared small under the towering columns, yet grounded in a peace that radiated from inside. His voice was quiet, but sure. His first words have been not approximately authority or doctrine. They had been about prayer, approximately humility, about traveling collectively. The gang failed to want grand gestures. They'd already been moved by means of the very wonder of his election. The person before them changed into unknown to many, however the appearance in his eyes, the gentleness, the sincerity, needed no introduction. Tagle watched from within the apostolic palace, now not as a disappointed runner-up, but as a person witnessing the Spirit at paintings. He had as soon as seen Pope Francis emerge on that same balcony, smiling awkwardly, blessing the people with trembling hands. Now he noticed Pope Leo XIV doing the equal, not mimicking Francis, but echoing the equal humility that had captured the hearts of thousands and thousands. Within the days that followed, Tagle meditated often on what had came about in the Sign Chapel. He changed into requested in many instances with the aid of newshounds how he felt what it become like to take a seat so near the moment the church changed route. But he constantly spoke back the equal way. It wasn't politics. It became liturgy. To him the conclave became no longer just an election. It became a sacred ritual. The vestments, the prayers, the oath of secrecy, the candlelight, it became not rite for the sake of tradition. It became transformation. The Spirit had moved and everybody who became present, whether or not they knew it or now not, had been touched. He advised one interviewer, in 2013, I puzzled why we needed to put on the entire choir get dressed all through the conclave. However now I apprehend. There are moments in existence which are too holy for casualness. You wear vestments now not for show, but due to the fact the soul is being lifted into something beyond itself. And then he introduced quietly, I saw Christ in that room. Within the private conversations, Tagle shared extra private reflections. He had observed the exact second the votes became in posts prefer. It turned into throughout the third poll on the second day. There has been a pause within the counting, a stillness within the air that felt almost tangible. The call become repeated time and again until the full crossed the line of actuality. Tagle appeared over and he saw something he would by no means forget. Now not ambition fulfilled, no longer relief, but a person being damaged open by grace. Later, someone asked him if he had hoped to be elected. He replied with a smile and no hesitation. I hoped the right man or woman might be elected, and he changed into. The Church might come to realize Pope Leo XIV in the months in advance, his style, his voice, his vision. But Cardinal Tagle already knew him. He knew the quiet, considerate man who carried a wooden rosary from Peru in his pocket, who woke early to hope earlier than sunrise, who preferred asking inquiries to giving orders. He knew the man who had walked the streets of Lima with nothing but sandals and a heart for the poor, and that information added him joy, no longer due to the fact his friend had come to be pope, however because the Church had been given a shepherd who did no longer are seeking the throne, but the towel. As the sun set over St. Peter's at the night time of the white smoke, Tagle remained at prayer, by myself inside the chapel. Arms folded, heartful. The arena had shouted, the bells had rung, the cameras had flashed, however heaven had spoken in silence. The daylight filtering through the excessive home windows of the apostolic palace solid lengthy golden beams throughout the polished ground. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle sat quietly near the equal window where he had as soon as watched pigeons flutter over the colonnade of St. Peter's Square. His eyes had been fixed not at the bustling plaza under, however on memory, on the difference among sacred moments that had modified the path of church records and his personal existence. He were inside the Sign Chapel twice as a cardinal elector. As soon as in 2013 whilst Pope Benedict XV's resignation had greatly surprised the arena and opened the door for Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio to grow to be Pope Francis. And now once more in 2025 when the demise of Pope Francis brought a final poignant near in generation. Each conclave were wrapped in silence and sacred ritual. Each had been governed with the aid of the equal guidelines. But in Tagle's heart, that they had unfolded as entirely extraordinary religious worlds. In 2013, there was an unusual tension within the air. A living pope had stepped aside, voluntarily relinquishing the Petrine ministry. Though the cardinals were respectful, even reverent, there has been additionally an unspoken undercurrent of uncertainty. Become this a precedent? Turned into it an exception? Tagle remembered looking around the Sign Chapel and seeing colleagues trembling because he knew the arena would not absolutely understand the kind of pope they had just obtained. Rapid forward to 2025. This time the silence within the Sign Chapel became deeper. The chair of Peter changed into empty, not just vacant however actually empty. Pope Francis had surpassed into eternal life, and together with his departure came a new degree of religious gravity. There has been no ambiguity, no theoretical precedent. The Church became mourning a father even because it searched for a new one. It became a specific silence, Tagle later reflected to a group of seminarians, no longer anxious, now not unsure, however deeply spiritual, as though every brick of the chapel knew that heaven became listening. The rituals had been the equal, the oaths, the vestments, the ballots, however the surroundings became holier, by some means, much less political, extra-liturgical. Each moment felt as though it were being carved into the memory of the Church, no longer simply history, however eternity. Tagle took his seat close to the middle, just a few chairs down from Cardinal Robert Prevost. He knew Prevost properly. They had served collectively in Rome for years. There was constantly a calmness approximately him, a planned kindness that in no way felt rehearsed. He had that uncommon capability to stay silent without acting remote, to speak simply without being simplistic. Tagle had by no means heard him boost his voice. But in moments of hysteria or uncertainty, it became Prevost humans instinctively became too. As the ballots proceeded over the first day and a half, Tagle felt something he hadn't expected, familiarity, now not simply with the process, but with the sacred rhythm of all of it. It changed into as if the Holy Spirit turned into choreographing something beyond human orchestration. While the ballots started to tilt unmistakably toward Prevost, there was no scramble, no objection, no gasps. There was a quiet acknowledgement inside the room, as if grace had started to bloom inside the silence. Tagle remembered the final matter. He remembered seeing Submit lower his head, close his eyes, and breathe a sluggish, uneven breath, the sort one takes, earlier than moving into the unknown. And simply as vividly he remembered praying now, not due to the fact he had to but because his coronary heart had moved him. He prayed that the brand new pope could now not carry the load of expectation, however the freedom of grace. He prayed that Prevost could recognize he became now not alone. He prayed that the world would recognize in Pope Leo XIV now not a victor, however a servant. Later in private reflection, Tagle became requested to explain the difference among the two conclaves. He stated silence, of reverence, of the quiet majesty of liturgical subculture. But he also noted transformation. In 2013, we have been studying what it's supposed to pick a pope at the same time as one nonetheless lived. He stated in 2025, we remembered what it's supposed to select from the coronary heart of mourning, from the void of loss. One felt like stepping forward into uncertainty. The other felt like kneeling earlier than Thriller. Both conclaves had fashioned him, but in distinctive approaches. The primary had taught him how deeply the Church can marvel itself. The second one taught him how faithfully the Spirit stays present whilst the Church is at its maximum inclined. He meditated too on the symbolic electricity of vestments. At the start, in 2013, he had discovered it bizarre to wear full choir get dressed for a vote, but now he understood the robes were not for look. They had been armor. They had been no longer about honor, but approximately protection. Reminders that the one vote casting turned into now not just a guy with a choice, however a priest with a calling. I wore them otherwise this time, he admitted softly. Not due to the fact I anticipated whatever, however because I understood the load of the instant. We have been no longer simply deciding on a front-runner. We have been getting into a liturgy that had eternal outcomes. And now sitting with the aid of that window overlooking the square, Tagle knew that the one's conclaves would define his understanding of the Church for the rest of his existence, no longer because they had chosen historic popes, however because that they had discovered something undying, that the Spirit moves nice while men are silent. That management in the Church isn't always one. It's miles given that humility nevertheless holds the deepest power. He might often say to younger priests and bishops, never are trying to find to be chosen, are seeking for to be trustworthy. The Lord knows what to do with a devoted heart. Pope Leo Fountain XIV had no longer come from a campaign. He had come from prayer. And in that, Tagle noticed the future of the Church, quiet, discerning, rooted not within the applause of the gang, but in the still small voice that speaks while all others fall silent. The spotlight of the arena never lingered lengthy at the people who didn't win. Inside the aftermath of a conclave, interest is drawn upward to the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, to the man in white, to the name etched in history. However, for Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the beauty of that second wasn't in being selected for the papacy. It became in not wanting to be. From the day he had been accelerated to cardinal by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012, Tagle had constantly remained remarkably detached from the murmurs of ambition that frequently swirl around excessive rating clerics. Whilst his name first regarded on lists of ability popes, specifically after Pope Benedict's resignation, it had never sat without problems with him. The worldwide media might have been inquisitive about the idea of an Asian Francis, a humble theologian from the Philippines who preached like a missionary and smiled like an infant. But Tagle himself had always observed the eye unsettling. I do not know a way to carry expectancies that are not from God, he had as soon as said quietly to a chum. It wasn't fake humility. It became formation. Raised in a home where religion became lived, no longer lectured, Tagle had been taught early on that greatness within the Church was now not measured via titles, but by using love. He had carried that reality with him through seminary, through the study room, through the slums of Manila, and ultimately to the halls of the Vatican. Whilst he rose through the ranks, he never allowed the jobs to become an identification. By the point, Summo Deum Prolus Habentes. With most effective God earlier than their eyes, that line had become his anchor, his protect, his reminder that a conclave become no longer a human contest. It was now not about charisma, geography, or recognition. It became about discernment. It became about the Spirit. The days leading as much as the conclave have been strangely severe. Rome buzzed with predictions. Tagle attempted to preserve his workouts steady. Each day mass, silent prayer, a brief stroll through the gardens when he may want to. However, the eyes that observed him were specific this time. There has been an expectation, nearly a longing from many that checked out him as if he already wore white. He added that weight with him into the sign chapel, but he did no longer deliver it on my own. Earlier than the first vote turned into cast, as cardinals made their solemn oath to vote best for the man they believed God became choosing, Tagle bowed his head longer than most. His heart beat progressively, no longer because he became calm, but because he had surrendered. Whatever came about could be God's will. The ballots got here and went slowly. The tide became closer to any other guy, Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost. Tagle felt no danger, no envy, best readability. As he watched the votes gather in Prevost's desire, he felt a deep unexplainable peace settle over his soul. It wasn't detachment. It was something more, a joy that got here from knowing he were faithful to the system and that the Church was receiving the chief it wished. God chooses from the heart, he later said in a short interview. And in case your heart is free, you'll understand his voice whilst he speaks via others. After the brand new pope was introduced, the sector asked the query it continually asks of individuals who have been nearly selected. How did he sense? It was requested with a subtle side, a presumption that sadness must have crept in. However, Tagle's answer became mild and unwavering. I felt alleviation. I felt awe. And principally, I felt grateful that I didn't need to upward thrust so as to serve. He supposed each phrase. Later that night, after the official bulletins and celebrations, Tagle returned to his easy quarters. He knelt in his personal chapel by myself inside the quiet and prayed the same prayer he had provided as a boy. Lord, make me your servant. There was no want for thrones, earrings, or titles to satisfy that prayer. In the weeks that observed, Tagle obtained infinite messages from the world over. Congratulations on how he carried himself, sympathy from people who wanted he were selected, admiration from the ones inspired by means of his grace. He read each note, replied to as many as he should, and thanked God for the opportunity to reflect Christ via humility. He additionally acquired one letter that he saved tucked interior his breviary. A short word from Pope Leo XIV himself. It's study, thank you for supporting me convey this move even earlier than I knew it would be mine. Your peace gave me courage. Your silence gave me electricity. It was signed really, Robert. That letter meant extra to Tagle than any headline ever ought to. In the public eye, he became the person who could have been Pope. But in God's eyes and in his very own, he was precisely in which he turned into speculated to be. Not above, no longer below, but beside. He once instructed a group of young bishops for the duration of a retreat, the best region in the church is the bottom rung at the ladder of love. It is the only closest to Christ's toes, chosen no longer to rise, however to walk alongside, no longer to rule, but to hope, no longer to be followed, but to observe. And in that sacred hiddenness, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle observed something rarer than a white cassock. He found freedom. There are moments inside the lifestyles of the Church whilst records does not honestly repeat, it harmonizes. The election of Pope Leo XIV, an Augustinian missionary from the Americas following the profoundly Jesuit papacy of Pope Francis turned into one such moment. Inside the quiet corners of the Vatican, in which liturgy and reminiscence intertwine, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle ought to see greater simply than maximum, how this became no longer a ruin in the tale, however a sacred continuation, religious traditions now joined on the helm of the Church. Tagle had always been a pupil of charisms, long earlier than he entered the cure, before his call appeared on lists of papabile, earlier than his days in Manila and his lengthy nights in Rome. He were inquisitive about the religious moves that shaped the heart of the Church. He noticed them now not as booths or opponents, however as rivers flowing from the same divine source. Jesuit, Dominican, Franciscan, Augustinian, every changed into a reaction to a unique second in time, a one-of-a-kind cry of the people, a special whisper of the Spirit. And now in the early days of Pope Leo XIV's hold forth, he ought to sense the grace of that harmony. The Society of Jesus had given the Church Pope Francis, a person of vision, of worldwide outreach, of reform, rooted in discernment. His Jesuit thoughts had been formed by means of lengthy years of silent exam, his soul disciplined by the rigorous path of Magus, to usually are seeking what's extra for God. He had brought the papacy down from the marble throne to the dusty sandals of a shepherd. His was a voice for the peripheries, for the poor, for the wounded. His spirituality had shaken the Roman structure with a name to simplicity and compassion. Now came Pope Leo XIV, fashioned in the rule of St. Augustine. His heart too became restless, however in a different rhythm, wherein Ignatian spirituality sharpened discernment like a sword. Augustinian spirituality searched the coronary heart like a song. St. Augustine had no longer been born a saint. He had wandered through fame, pleasure, and ardor earlier than surrendering to grace. And it changed into that same surrender marked through tears and transformation that formed Pope Leo's way of being. Tagle saw it at once. He as soon as advised a collection of religious men and women, we are not looking a brand new melody update the antique. We're listening to melodies performed collectively. Francis and Leo, Ignatius and Augustine. Voices, one concord. He saw how deeply the Augustinian legacy ran through Pope Leo XIV, within the manner he spoke, by no means with sharp edges, however with the gentleness of a heart nevertheless listening. In the way he paused earlier than talking, it became no longer contradiction. It became conversation. Tagle started out to proportion this perception with others, particularly amongst clergy and seminarians who worried about alternate or confusion. Do now not see a change in cast 6 and worry a trade in heart. He could say the spirit is not fickle. She does no longer abandon one direction to try some other. She deepens the journey. The traditions of Ignatius and Augustine have been in many ways companions of their starvation for fact. Each saints had lived in instances of crisis. Each had searched the arena for meaning best to locate it in Christ. Each had written with fireplace of their bones and tears in their eyes. And each had taught the church a way to struggle with the self, a way to confront sin without despair, how to give up now not to defeat but to grace. Tagle frequently quoted Augustine's well-known line, "You have not made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are stressed until they rest in you." But now below Pope Leo XIV, he commenced to mirror on it with new intensity. He saw within the new pope that equal restlessness, no longer of bewilderment, however of compassion, a restlessness that would no longer permit him sit down idle at the same time as human beings suffered. A restlessness that could guide his decisions now not towards recognition, but toward holiness. One evening, as they sat collectively after an extended day of conferences, Tagle spoke candidly to the new pope. "You and Francis," he stated, "are elements of the identical confession." Leo appeared at a loss for words. Tagle smiled. "Francis showed the church what it looks as if to return to the daddy. You're displaying her what it looks like to live with him after we come domestic." The pope chuckled, then nodded slowly. "And we each realize the adventure in no way ends." Tagle knew that no longer every body would understand this transition. A few could assume dramatic shifts. Others might hope for reversals, but he noticed virtually the deeper thread become continuity, now not in coverage, but in spirit. He commenced to speak extra publicly approximately this imaginative and prescient. At a meeting of non-secular educators, he defined how every pope brings his own items, however the Holy Spirit weaves them collectively. "We are not a church of personalities," he said. "We are a church of saints, and the saints, even in their variations, educate us one lesson. Give up." Impersonal, he told more youthful monks not to compare Francis and Leo as though they were warring parties in a debate. "Do not choose among Ignatius and Augustine." He would say, "Allow them to both educate you." And inside himself, Tagle felt a quiet joy, now not simplest due to the fact the church turned into in true arms, but due to the fact those palms had been shaped by way of traditions he had continually loved, traditions that reminded the faithful now not to chase perfection, however to open their hearts to grace. Francis had shown the sector a church that walks humbly. Leo would now show her how to relaxation in God's love. Even as walking, Tagle saw the splendor of all of it. No longer a change of course, but a deepening of the course. Not the final of a bankruptcy, but the beginning of a new stanza within the same hymn. And as he watched the brand new Pope kneel in prayer below the dome of St. Peter's, he whispered a prayer of his own. "Saint Ignatius, guide his imaginative and prescient. Saint Augustine, regular his heart. Holy Spirit, maintain your music playing." The morning sunlight fell softly throughout the mosaic floor of the papal examen, catching in its golden beam the worn fringe of a timber crucifix at the desk. Pope Leo XIV sat quietly, a pen in his hand, but the web page earlier than him remained clean. For a person who had lived many lives in many lands, silence had continually been greater than a pause. It turned into an area to take into account. He became now the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Successor of Peter, vicar of Christ. Yet while he closed his eyes, he changed into nevertheless Father Robert. He saw not marble and gold, however adobe walls, dusty village roads, and faces framed via solar and warfare. He heard the murmurs of Quechua talking ladies in a Peruvian chapel, the cries of children inquiring for bread, the rustle of leaves wherein he as soon as walked on my own with God. He remembered Peru now not as a place he had visited, however as a domestic that had formed his priesthood. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle had often spoken of Pope Leo as a person of worlds. It wasn't a metaphor. It became a truth formed through a long time of task, identity, and grace. Born and raised inside the United States, Robert Prevost were molded by using North American sensibilities, pragmatism, field, clarity of notion. However, it became in Latin America the various bad and marginalized that his soul were set on hearth. He discovered how to be a priest in English, Tagle once said with a grin. However, he learned a way to love like Christ in Spanish as he settled into the early weeks of his papacy. Pope Leo XIV carried this duality with him no longer as a burden but as a bridge. The church he now led became not divided by means of geography. It was made richer via it. From the crowded parishes of Lagos to the icy parishes in Quebec, from jungle missions inside the Amazon to refugee chapels in Syria, the frame of Christ spanned each subculture and continent. And Pope Leo XIV in his very flesh and memory bore that universality. Tagle had long trendy this about him. They'd spoken frequently over time approximately what it's supposed to serve a church that turned into more and more multicultural, multilingual, and multiola. The middle of gravity in Catholicism had shifted quietly, however undeniably closer to the global south. And whilst the Roman Curia were slow to regulate, the human beings of God had already started to speak a brand new language of religion, one rooted in resilience, track, suffering, and pleasure. In Pope Francis, the sector had visible a pope who spoke from the margins. In Pope Leo XIV, the world became starting to see a pope who had lived in them. It wasn't uncommon in the Vatican to listen aides speak of the way the brand new pope could often wreck protocol. He might pause to greet a preservation worker in the hallway or ask for the call of a kitchen assistant earlier than blessing his food. One shield noted how on his second day Leo walked into the chapel barefoot and knelt in silence for almost an hour, palms resting on the edge of the pew like a man kneeling beside a friend's grave. He prays like a person who's been alone with God, the defense stated quietly. Tagle wasn't surprised. He had visible this generally throughout their years of collaboration. As leaders of foremost dicasteries, Tagle over evangelization and Post over bishops, they had shared obligations that required them to navigate a number of the maximum complex issues dealing with the modern. That pastoral coronary heart had made its way into every choice Leo now confronted. He wasn't dashing to make modifications. He wasn't issuing declarations. He became watching, listening, praying. Some saw this as hesitation. Others feared it signaled indecisiveness. But Tagle knew better. He's letting the Spirit move before he does, he stated for the duration of a verbal exchange with a group of young non-secular sisters. In an international that actions fast, the Church wishes a person who actions deep. What made Pope Leo XIV's angle so unique wasn't just his missionary background. It became the reality that he had lived the contradiction such a lot of Catholics stay today, being from one global but serving in another. Being fashioned with the aid of one lifestyle, however converted by way of another. He knew what it meant to straddle the tensions of modernity and way of life, of wealth and poverty, of institutional energy and grassroots fragility. And this perhaps greater than anything made him relatable to the Church in Asia, Africa, and Latin US. Tagle as soon as remarked, in the Philippines, when humans heard that Robert had become Pope, they failed to say, "Oh, an American Pope." They stated, "It truly is the priest who listened to us. That is the missionary who stayed." This turned into the type of reputation Leo valued most, not for his titles or eloquence, but for his nearness. He had made himself to be had in ways that maximum high-rating clergy never did. He stayed after Mass to speak to grandmothers. He listened patiently to seminarians struggling with doubt. He visited prisoners without cameras. He wrote letters by using hand. Now as Pope, he knew the expectations could be unique. There could be strain to outline a legacy, to chart a brand new route. However, in his heart, he remained the identical missionary priest who had as soon as walked for hours to reach a far-flung chapel simply to carry the Eucharist to 10 people. Tagle regularly contemplated at the importance of this. A pope with calluses on his toes, he might say, is a pope who knows a way to bring the Church. The beauty of Pope Leo XIV's papacy turned into no longer in grand gestures, however in small consistencies, behavior of presence, of humility, of constancy. And in a worldwide church an increasing number of fractured via ideology and tribalism, such consistency changed into a bomb. Pope Leo XIV changed into now not seeking to be everybody else. He was no longer a second Francis or a counterpoint to Benedict. He turned into Robert Faust, a person of two worlds now known as to serve a church that belongs to every world. And in that vocation, Tagle saw the hand of God. It changed into a clear spring morning in Rome when Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped into the small chapel close to the papal residence. There were no guards this time, no crowd, no formal entrance, simply the quiet sound of tender sandals on marble and the low hum of early morning prayer. He had come not as a tourist, now not as a dignitary, but as a brother, one of the many non-secular sons of the Church, who understood that this second in time carried a deeper message. The Church belonged to all, and its father became now a man who should talk to every nook of the earth from the coronary heart of it. Pope Leo XIV had simplest been within the chair of Peter for a few weeks, however already the signs of his approach to the papacy have been rising, now not in decrees or dramatic reforms, but in something far more powerful presence, the sort of presence that became deeply pastoral, deliberately inclusive, and unshakably human. Tagle located with admiration how the new pope moved through his day. He spoke less than most leaders, but he listened greater. He read every report with care, however he paid extra interest to the eyes of folks that introduced them. And even though he now bore the load of the church on his shoulders, he walked with the calm and style of a person who knew that the role did no longer belong to him, but to Christ operating through him. What made Pope Leo XIV wonderful changed into now not simply his intelligence or enjoy. It turned into his intuition to acquire, no longer to split. He saw differences, cultural, theological, pastoral, now not as threats, but as opportunities for deeper communion. He believed absolutely and deeply that a bishop from Africa, a clergyman from Asia, and a lay lady from Latin the US could take a seat at the identical desk and contact each other family. That perception wasn't summary. It was how he had lived. In the course of one verbal exchange among the two, Tagle had remarked, "You understand the church as a tapestry, no longer as a uniform." Leo had smiled, "Due to the fact God is the weaver, no longer us." And that information fashioned every decision he made. One in all his first gestures as Pope were to reach out for my part to bishops from nations often ignored in global Catholic discourse. He dispatched handwritten notes to small dioceses in Myanmar, Burkina Faso and the Solomon Islands asking approximately their communities, their demanding situations, their hopes. In Go Back, he received pics of youngsters in handmade vestments, letters in damaged English thanking him for remembering them, and even drawings from village catechism college students who had in no way earlier than visible a pope who checked out them, no longer passed them. Tagle noticed this and knew it turned into not a political approach. It was fatherhood. There may be a difference, he said in a talk with younger priests in Manila. Some leaders need to command. Others want to attach. Pope Leo connects due to the fact he is aware that the church isn't always fabricated from homes and regulations. It is made of people and those want to be loved. For individuals who had longed to see a pope who could embody the global nature of the church without alienating its roots, Pope Leo XIV changed into a gift. And his connection with Tagle only deepened that imaginative and prescient. Together they represented what the church was becoming. Collaborative pastoral, deeply spiritually and joyfully various. While the Vatican introduced that Pope Leo XIV might be installed with representatives from all three orders of cardinals, Tagle from the order of bishops, Cardinal Mbongo from the clergymen, and Cardinal Minerdi from the deacons, it became more than symbolic. It was intentional. It became Leo's way of saying this isn't always my papacy. This is our church. Tagle had organized the words he might say, working towards them now not in front of a reflect, however in front of a tabernacle. He wanted every phrase to carry now not ceremony, but reality. Holy Father, may additionally Christ, the Son of the living God, the shepherd and mother or father of our souls, who built his church upon the rock, supply you the ring, the seal of Peter, the fisherman, who positioned his hope in him on the Sea of Galilee, and to whom the Lord Jesus entrusted the keys of the dominion of heaven. He knew that once those words were spoken, the world could be looking. However, he hoped that for one brief second, they would not see a rite. They might see a legacy. They could see the passing of challenge, not simply title. They might see the face of the church, historical and ever new. In his very own prayers, Tagle might frequently whisper the phrases of St. Paul to his groups. I have become all matters to all of us so that I might win some for Christ. He believed Pope Leo XIV become residing those words each day, turning into near the lonely, mild with the wounded, company with the proud, and open to the ones at the margins. For the Church in Asia, Tagle had grown to be a beacon of hope for years. Now in Pope Leo, the people of the global Church saw a father, now not a distant ruler, however someone who had shared their poverty, who had walked their roads, who had spoken their languages and eaten their meals. He wasn't simply the Pope from the USA. He changed into the Pope who belonged to no person area and to each country. Because the sun dipped over St. Peter's. That night, Tagle stood at his window, searching out not simply at a metropolis, but at a church renewed. He noticed the pilgrims, the laughter, the movement. He noticed signs and symptoms in lots of languages. And he heard the bells, not simply of Rome, however in his coronary heart, the bells of the venture calling him to stroll along the person he had referred to as brother lengthy earlier than the world referred to as him Holy Father. Two fathers, one church. The early morning hours in Vatican town have been unusually quiet, as if the world itself had paused in reverence. The cobblestones of St. Peter's rectangular, nonetheless glistening from the dew, awaited footsteps that could mark the beginning of a new bankruptcy inside the church's long and sacred records. In the basilica, the preparations for the inaugural Mass of Pope Leo XIV have been almost entire. Cardinals moved in prayerful silence. Choirs rehearsed with careful restraint. And in a small room at the back of the altar, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle sat keeping an object that shimmered with centuries of meaning, the fisherman's ring. It changed into no longer embellished with diamonds or made for show. It was crafted with simplicity, its face bearing the picture of St. Peter casting his internet. This ring had been part of the papal investiture for hundreds of years. Though its use had changed, not sealing documents or papal edicts, it remained the signal of succession, the seal of harmony, the quiet reminder that the brand new pontiff turned into not a ruler, but a servant of servants. And nowadays would area it at the hand of Pope Leo XIV. He held the ring lightly in his palm, now not with fear, however with awe. No longer as it represented energy, but as it represented a promise. The promise of a person to shepherd, to suffer, and to love. He knew the load it carried became not in its metallic, but in its which means. As he waited, he pondered on how a long way the Church had come to attain this moment. He thought of Pope Benedict XVI's resignation years earlier, an act of humility that startled the arena. He remembered Pope Francis's arrival, his voice shaking as he asked the human beings to bless him earlier than he blessed them. He remembered the laughter, the cries, the pain, and the mercy that flowed over time that observed. And now right here he was once more, kneeling before the altar, making ready no longer to get hold of a hoop, but to give one to a man he had prayed with. Worked with and quietly cherished as a brother. The symbolism of the moment became now not misplaced on him. Tagle, the Filipino cardinal, often seen as a bridge between East and West, would now lay the symbol of Peter's authority at the hand of an American-born missionary who had spent most of his lifestyle serving the bad in Latin the USA. Two men, two continents, one venture. It became a gesture soaked in grace. However, even past the wealthy symbolism, there has been something private. Tagle remembered certainly one of his first deep conversations with Prevost Lower back in 2022. They had been reviewing a series of episcopal nominations and discussing the growing globalization of the Church. Prevost had said something that stayed with Tagle for years. "We're no longer here to symbolize international locations," he had said. "We are here to symbolize Christ wherever he leads." Now Christ had led them each to this second. Tagle with the ring, Vost with the hand that would put on it. The moment arrived. Pope Leo XIV, clad inside the white vestments of his new workplace, approached the altar. The basilica, though large and magnificent, fell into a nearly supernatural hush. Millions around the arena have been watching the stay broadcast. Yet inner those marble columns, time regarded to sluggish, as if heaven itself leaned in to concentrate. Tagle progressed. He held the hoop aloft, now not as a crown, however as a covenant. His voice became calm and consistent, but those nearest may want to pay attention the faint quiver of emotion below the floor. He spoke the traditional phrases with care, as though carving them into the air with reverence. Maximum Holy Father, might also Christ, the Son of the dwelling God, Shepherd and Father or Mother of our souls, who constructed his church upon the rock, provide you the hoop, the seal of Peter, the fisherman, who located his consider in him on the ocean of Galilee, and to whom the Lord entrusted the keys of the dominion of heaven. Pope Leo prolonged his hand. Tagle took it gently, the identical way he had once taken the arms of elderly parishioners in Manila, or those of weeping mothers in refugee camps, with tenderness, with understanding, and with deep affection. He slid the hoop onto Leo's finger. It suited flawlessly. For a second, they did not pass. Their eyes met. No words exceeded among them, however the message became unmistakable. Tagle's gaze said, I consider in you. Leo's return said, I will not stroll by myself. The basilica erupted in track. Trumpets sounded. Bells rang from each tower, the crowd cheered. But those phrases have been now not intended for applause. They had been supposed as a signpost for the adventure in advance. As the new pope turned to bless the human beings, Tagle stepped back, joining the other cardinals. Yet something had shifted. Although nevertheless wearing scarlet, he seemed wrapped in light, now not due to the fact he had come to be extra, however because he had given extra. He had given the ring, he had given the blessing, and he had given his brother to the church. While he lowered back to his house that night time, Tagle found a note slipped below his door. It was handwritten, quick, and easy. Thanks for making the invisible seen. Pray for me as I carry this ring, no longer with pride, but with prayer. Leo Tagle examined it 2 times. Then he knelt by way of his mattress and whispered the prayer of St. Peter himself. Lord, all matters. You already know that I really like you. The sun had simply began to upward thrust over the dome of St. Peter's Basilica whilst Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped into the Nook Café, tucked away at the back of the Apostolic Palace. It became a humble location acknowledged basically to 3 clerics and longtime Vatican staff where the aroma of strong Italian espresso mingled with the warm temperature of familiar agency. The barista greeted him with a smile and a gentle Buongiorno Inza before pouring his common, a cappuccino dusted gently with cinnamon, simply the manner he appreciated it. A few moments later, a second parent stepped into the café. Satisfied in a simple white cast with a modest pectoral cross, Pope Leo XIV entered without guards, without fanfare, and with a acquainted glint of enjoyment in his eyes. Tagle seemed up, grinned, and shook his head gently. You are late, he stated, a teasing lilt in his voice. Leo smiled back. I finished to bless a cat on the steps of Santa Marta. She gave the impression of she wanted it more than I did. They laughed. This became how lots of their mornings had started, even earlier than Leo had become pope, long before white cassocks and fishermen's rings. Their friendship had been grounded in early conversations over coffee. Conversations that touched on everything from theological nuances to the satisfactory manner to prepare dinner rice without burning it. They could communicate about scripture, the country of the church, their childhoods, or definitely share jokes too easy to be repeated in any reputable biography. But now something had changed. Not in their friendship, however, in the world round it. The man who now stirred his coffee beside Tagle turned into now not most effective a brother, but the non-secular father of over 1,000 million people. The weight of the office turned into real. And yet here in this café, they nevertheless spoke with the identical familiarity, the equal humanity. Leave out those mornings, Tagle said quietly. Earlier than all the conferences, the selections, the expectancies, Leo nodded, sipping thoughtfully. I do not because I nonetheless have them weigh to you. Tagle looked at him unsure. You take me back to the fact, Leo endured, of who I used to be earlier than the white cassack. And every so often in this new international, that's the most important component. Tagle's face softened. And who is that? Leo smiled. A man who by no means idea he'd be right here. A missionary who nevertheless prefers dusty shoes to marble flooring. A clergyman who'd alternatively concentrate than speak. And now, a pope who nonetheless unearths time for espresso, Tagle brought. They each laughed again, and for a moment it felt like no time had exceeded in any respect. The truth was, the Vatican could be a lonely location. Despite the grandeur, the art, and the reverence, it turned into additionally a place of weighty decisions, high expectancies, and countless scrutiny. Popes had been regularly in demand, occasionally attacked, but not often understood. It's why this friendship mattered. It grounded Leo. It reminded him of the church past the headlines, the one packed with human faces, not just protocols and policies. Tagle had lengthily been regarded for his capability to carry pleasure into heavy rooms. His chuckle became infectious. His capability to tell a tale, whether or not of a toddler in Manila or a vintage lady in a Vietnamese village, became nearly a ministry in itself. Leo often stated that Tagle's presence wasn't simply conversation. It became incarnation. He made people experience scene. And now greater than ever, the Pope wished someone who could appearance past the title and notice the man. That morning their communication drifted closer to the imminent challenges, curial appointments, worldwide conflicts, a sin that wanted careful steering, but whilst they discussed those weighty matters, the tone remained mild. Tagle could interject with a proverb, Leo would respond with a memory. Collectively they would joy into duty. Don't forget the morning we were late for the Bishops' Convention in 2021? Tagle asked, grinning. How ought to I overlook you told the taxi driver to follow the spirit. He thought you intended the shortcut. He did proper through the Vatican gardens. They each laughed so hard the barista appeared up in alarm. But it became exact. It was holy. The early mornings had been sacred for another cause, too. They allowed space to be themselves, not simply symbols. As Pope Leo had observed, that turning into more and more rare. Every gesture became interpreted, each phrase examined. Each pause in speech became a headline. Yet here, across from Tagle, he should just be Robert again. I suppose human beings expect I do not laugh anymore, Leo said softly. Tagle checked out him. Then maybe it is time they heard it. Leo chuckled, then raised an eyebrow. However you know how loud it is, precisely. In fact, Leo's snort was mythical amongst people who knew him, deep, booming, and full of lifestyles. It turned into the sort of snicker that startled extreme bishops and extremely joyful nuns. It became sincere. It turned into unguarded. It became rare now. But not long past. Promise me something, Tagle stated after a pause. Anything. While the weight receives too heavy, name me. Now not as a cardinal, no longer as a prefect, simply as your buddy. I'll make the espresso. But those who listened carefully observed something else, too. A lightness in his tone, a grin that lingered, a pleasure that could not quite be explained. They did not realize it came from a cappuccino and a chum who made him chuckle before dawn. However, heaven knew. It had turned out to be a quiet rhythm within the early weeks of Pope Leo XIV's hold forth. Earlier than the sun rose, while lots of Rome became nevertheless wrapped in silence, he could walk the lengthy hall from his residence to the small private chapel tucked simply at the back of the apostolic palace. There he knelt alone, the white folds of his cassack, gently spilling onto the cold marble ground, and entered into deep prayer. No agenda, no papers, no body of workers, just him, the crucifix above the altar, and the silent weight of the church. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle had watched this dependency form with quiet admiration. He had recognized Pope Leo for years, long before the papal white, and he identified this version of his buddy, contemplative, patient, listening, now not just to the voices of those round him, however to the voice of the Holy Spirit. It was, Tagle believed, one among Leo's maximum defining qualities, discernment. Not like leaders who rushed to movement, or who relied on the equipment of forms to outline their choices, Pope Leo moved with sacred warning. He wasn't gradual due to the fact he became unsure. He was sluggish because he refused to permit the urgency of the arena override the promptings of God. Every desire, every appointment, every phrase he allowed them to ferment in prayer earlier than they took form in motion. This word Tagle regularly used turned into discerner. In lots of languages it meant person who discerns. But within the Church it carried richer meaning. It signified a person who listens first, who does no longer presume, who waits for readability instead of greedy for control. And that became precisely how Pope Leo had approached his first days as Pope. From the moment he stepped out onto the loggia overlooking St. Peter's Rectangular, Leo had resisted the strain to announce. He had not rushed to call new curial officials. He had now not unveiled sweeping reforms. And while the media buzzed with hypothesis, thinking why he hadn't acted yet, the ones near him knew higher. He turned into already appearing with the aid of listening. Tagle, now serving as a close advisor and non-secular partner, explained it this way in the course of a communiqué with seminarians. True discernment isn't indecision. It's far attention. It's far asking not what need to I do, however what is God already doing and how do I be part of him. In the Vatican, some officers determined the new pope's pace unusual. One pro-prelate commented privately, "He is not sluggish, he is just deep." Others conversant in the moved quickly pace of church politics discovered themselves gaining knowledge of to pause. Conferences began with longer silences. Briefings ended with time for mirrored image. It changed into a cultural shift, however an essential one. Pope Leo would often sit within the papal garden inside the past due afternoons, walking amongst olive timber and reading the Gospels aloud to himself. It reminded him of his days in Peru where he would take long walks into the hills after Mass, the Bible tucked underneath his arm, pausing to meditate on the phrases of Jesus as farmers handed through with their animals. He carried that dependency into his papacy. He wasn't looking for thoughts. He was looking for confirmation, for peace, for the whisper of God that so often receives drowned out through applause or panic. Tagle noticed the difference this made while severe matters arose. There was, as an example, the issue of episcopal appointments in numerous annoying regions of the world, regions wherein the Church turned into being pulled between cultural identity and global communion. In preference to deferring without delay to diplomatic recommendation or nicely worn protocols, Pope Leo asked for prayer. He convened small listening sessions. He heard without delay from nearby leaders. He even reached out to missionaries who had served in those locations decades in advance, and best then after weeks of mirrored image did he communicate. Tagle later commented in an interview, he does not speak from the pinnacle of the mountain. He speaks from the valley after he has walked it. It changed into a model of management that deeply moved Tagle. It reminded him of the early church fathers who believed that earlier than one ruled he have to first speedy. Before one dominated, he ought to first weep. Before one preached, he must first pay attention. He saw in Leo a frontrunner fashioned now not via structures, but by way of solitude. One afternoon, after an extended assembly discussing the future of the synod on synodality, Tagle located the Pope sitting quietly in his examen, a unmarried candle burning close to the window. The papers that they had simply reviewed have been stacked smartly at the desk, untouched. "You haven't read them yet?" Tagle asked. "I've studied them with my eyes," Leo spoke back softly. "However, now not with my heart. That takes greater time." It became that sort of reaction that made others accept as true with him because it confirmed that he become now not performing. He turned into discerning. There has been no ego in his decisions. No rush to prove himself. He did not talk due to the fact the cameras were on. He spoke while the Spirit moved. And when he did, his phrases carried a weight past rhetoric. They carried peace. Tagle saw how even the personnel around Leo started out to exchange. Young aides began arriving earlier to sign up for him in prayer. Secretaries started out to carve out quiet time before drafting speeches. Even senior Vatican officials lengthy used to the politics of impact started asking distinct questions. What is the Spirit asking folks in preference to what will the clique say? It was as if Leo's discernment changed into coaching the church a way to breathe again. Tagle later remarked at some stage in a press briefing, Pope Leo isn't trying to lead with answers. He's main with questions, the kind that lead us deeper into the thriller of God. And perhaps that was the best present of his pontificate up to now, no longer a sweeping decree or a headline-grabbing reform, but a name to stillness, a reminder that in a church frequently tempted to behave before it listens, the deeper path is always the slower one, the route of discernment, the direction of the shepherd. The heavy wood door of the Sala dell'Astoro creaked open as Cardinal Luis Antonio stepped internal. The room centuries old and cloaked in golden crimson become full of silence. Now not that his eyes moved slowly around the room, meeting the gaze of each cardinal, as if memorizing their expressions, their hesitations, their hopes. Then, after an extended moment, he stated just 5 phrases. I've come to pay attention first. Tagle could see it of their faces, the confusion, the shift in posture, the recalibration of expectancies. This was not how these meetings normally began. Papal sessions, in particular the ones held early in a hold-forth, were typically marked through company direction, clean outlines, and sometimes a heavy sense of hierarchy. But Pope Leo had damaged that rhythm. He wasn't there to command. He became there to understand. For Tagle, it changed into no longer sudden. He had seen this excellent in Leo for years, a thorough dedication to listening without interruption. Even in conditions that demanded quick selections, Leo would first searching for out the human beings in the back of the troubles. He believed that the voice of God frequently spoke via the concerns no person else had time to pay attention. That day the assembly unfolded extra like a retreat than a approach consultation. Pope Leo barely spoke after his opening line. He took notes. He asked mild follow-up questions. He every so often bowed his head as though praying silently for each speaker as they shared. And when disagreements arose, as they inevitably did, he by no means jumped in to accurate or side with one camp. He listened longer. It changed into no longer weakness. It became reverence. Tagle knew what most of the sector did not. Leo's area of listening got here from years in Peru, in which ministry wasn't formed by means of policies, but by using relationships. There, in far-off villages and parishes, he had discovered that the cries of the terrible were not constantly spoken aloud. They had been heard in pauses, in silences, in tales that did not have neat conclusions. Once Tell had asked Leo how he knew what selection to make when the records were not clean. I wait, Leo had stated, till my heart has stopped reacting and commenced receiving. That approach now formed the papacy, and at the same time as a few within the Curia had been unsure the way to adjust, many others discovered themselves surprisingly moved. One bishop from Sub-Sahara and Africa later shared with Tagle that it turned into the primary time in 30 years he had spoken so overtly in a Vatican meeting without fear of being brushed off. He heard me, the bishop said, as if my words mattered to the complete church. The way of life was transferring slowly however in reality. Pope Leo was teaching Rome a brand new rhythm, listening earlier than judging, discerning earlier than determining, and Tagle, now certainly one of his closest collaborators, became each a witness and an advice for that change. Whilst human beings criticized the brand new Pope's quietness, mistaking mirrored image for reluctance, Tagle might gently correct them. Silence isn't absence, he could say. In his silence, he's making room for the spirit, for the humans, for the fact. One night, after a specially hard meeting with numerous bishops deeply divided over pastoral techniques of their dioceses, Tagle and Leo shared a quiet meal in the papal eating room. The communique had been annoying with raised voices and slightly disguised frustration, however Pope Leo had said nearly nothing for the duration of the entire alternate. As they sat down with an easy plate of soup and bread, Tagle checked out him with problem. They have been waiting so as to settle it. I understand, Leo said softly, but they were not prepared to be settled. They had been geared up to be heard. Tagle shook his head. Most could have jumped in with a solution. Leo smiled faintly. It truly is how we become silencing the soul. We solution too speedy and we omit what's under the query. Tagle sat again in silence, humbled by the wisdom in that one sentence. Later that week, Pope Leo visited a neighborhood jail on the outskirts of Rome. No media were present. No pics were taken. He sat in a circle with a collection of guys convicted of significant crimes, listened to their tales, and prayed with them. One of the guards later instructed Tagle that the Pope had barely spoken the whole time. He simply nodded, touched their arms, and cried. The shield stated he made them sense like they were not monsters. That Tagle realized turned into the fruit of listening, not simply to voices, however to the elements of humans that the sector had already judged and discarded. In a Vatican so regularly pushed by precedent, by way of manage, by means of declarations, Pope Leo XIV became leading via attentiveness. He becomes showing that the coronary heart of Peter's ministry wasn't simply to proclaim, but to understand. Tagle began the use of this subject matter in his very own preaching. We cannot talk the truth of the gospel. He told a meeting of younger theologians, if we've not first listened to the injuries of the world, Christ himself did not come shouting from heaven. He got here as an infant, small, silent, inclined. The church must research again how to do the identical, and the people observed. In parishes throughout Rome and past, priests had been preaching greater slowly. Confessors had been spending greater time with penitent hearts. Bishops started protecting town corridor-style listening assassins. A brand new spirit was awakening inside the church, no longer born of reform, but of healing. The recovery of what it meant to be visible, heard, loved. And on the center of all of it turned into the man in white who rarely raised his voice, however, whose listening coronary heart became reshaping the very manner the church breathed. For Tagle it turned into now not simply an honor to serve beside him. It became a grace, a reminder that before doctrine, before structure, earlier than approach, there may be one issue that makes a shepherd, a heart that listens like Christ. The solemn notes of the pipe organ crammed St. Peter's Square because the liturgy of setup reached its most sacred moment. Masses of heaps had gathered beneath a cloudless Roman sky. Banners bearing the picture of the best shepherd fluttered above a sea of flags, arms raised in prayer and tear-streaked faces. As the liturgical procession commenced its descent in the direction of the altar, Pope Leo walked slowly, head bowed, his white garments lightly brushing the stone. He regarded no longer like a monarch, but like a pilgrim. A servant getting into the temple. The gang sensing the holiness of the moment quieted. Even the birds circling above regarded to pause in flight. Tagle stepped forward, their eyes met. Men who had journeyed together through silence and scripture, through synods and struggling. Tagle had as soon as been taken into consideration the favorite to wear, the white. However, now he stood here now not with regret, but with reverence. He held out the ring. There has been no fanfare, no whispered conversation. Only an extended pause as Leo prolonged his right hand. Tagle slid the hoop onto the Pope's finger with such gentleness it felt like a blessing. Then he bent low, not as a person defeated, however as one honoring the load of any other's name. And Pope Leo, moved through something deeper than words, leaned forward and whispered softly, "Thank you, brother." The microphones did no longer trap it, but the cameras captured the tears in Tagle's eyes as he smiled and stepped aside. For the looking world, it changed into a beautiful gesture. However, for the church, it changed into a moment of theological readability. Right here stood two shepherds, person who could have been pope and person who now became. Not competing, not comparing, however united in challenge. Tagle returned to his seat with a non-violent dignity. He had recognized that this second would come, and he had organized his heart for it. Within the days main up to the installation, he had fasted and prayed, asking the Lord to grant him now not simplest humility, but joy, and the Lord had answered. Because the homily started, Pope Leo spoke not of power, however of reason. "We aren't here to be fashionable," he said, "but to be damaged and shared just like the bread of heaven." His words flowed no longer with oratory flair, but with a calm strength that touched even the maximum skeptical hearts. He observed fishermen and moms, of forgotten villages and crowded prisons, of wounded souls longing to be healed. He observed a church that ought to choose compassion over mercy over management. And whilst he turned to mention the position of his brother, cardinals, his voice thickened. "Some of you've been my instructors, a number of you my challengers. One in every of you has been my closest accomplice. And these days I put on this ring due to the fact the Lord called, but additionally due to the fact one guy in deep obedience stepped returned so the church should circulate ahead." There was no need to mention Tagle's name. Absolutely everyone knew. Within the crowd, many wept. Aged nuns clutched rosaries. Young couples held arms greater tightly. Across the globe, television displays displayed an picture not of contention, however of fraternity. The sector had visible sufficient of ambition dressed in robes. These days they saw something distinct. Back within the sacristy after the Mass, the two men embraced for a long time in silence. Neither pointed out the ceremony. They didn't need to. Later that afternoon, Leo invited Tagle to stroll with him in the Vatican gardens, a way of life that was beginning to take root. As they wandered below the olive bushes, Leo reached for his ring and held it up. "It feels heavy," he stated. "It have to," Tagle spoke back. "It becomes solid by means of hearth." Leo checked out him with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "I understand what it approached to wear it, to carry it. Tagle stopped strolling and turned to him, and that I realize what it means to bypass it. That second greater than any headline or image described the new technology. Now not the coronation of a king, however the commissioning of a servant, and not just one servant, but two, certain now not by using rank, but with the aid of love." That night, a simple handwritten note was left on Tagle's desk. It bore the seal of the Holy Father in just one line. "Your palms placed the ring, however your heart located the person." Tagle smiled and became off the mild. In the morning he might begin his paintings anew, no longer as the Pope, however as the person who helped the Pope emerge as what the Church wished, and that he knew became extra than sufficient. The marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace echoed with the soft clicks of polished footwear as Pope Leo XIV made his manner through the Japanese wing. Daylight poured in through tall home windows, casting lengthy shafts of gold onto the tile ground. But it wasn't the splendor of the Vatican that crammed his thoughts. It turned into the ache inside the voice of the young female he had met simply 2 days in advance, an instructor from Aleppo. Her parish bombed, her circle of relatives scattered, her religion bruised, but not damaged. She had appeared him in the attention and asked, "Holy Father, is God nevertheless listening?" That query had followed him into his prayers, into his sleep, into the depths of his being. Now in his new position as shepherd of a wounded world, he felt the urgency to reply not with words however with actions. This chapter of his pontificate might be approximately going in which pain dwelled, approximately seeing, touching, and acknowledging the injuries of humanity. Because the Church's ethical compass, he knew he could not live within the safety of the Apostolic Palace. And so he referred to as for something extraordinary. He summoned Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle and some members of the papal family to the Domus Sancti Marti. The institution accrued in an easy meeting room seated round a modest table with notebooks, a map and a globe that had lengthy stood untouched in the nook of the room. "I want to go," the Pope stated without preamble. "Not simply ship envoys or letters. I want to go myself to the places in which they ask if God still sees them." Tagle nodded slowly. He understood deeply. "But Holy Father," one authentic interjected lightly. "A papal visit takes months to plot. Security, coordination, liturgy, press." Leo raised a hand. "Then permits plan it, however not like we usually have. This isn't approximately right." He watched the Pope kneel beside an elderly man whose legs were crippled via struggle. The person wept, now not due to ache, however, because nobody, now not even his very own bishop, had visited in years. And now the Bishop of Rome turned into keeping his hand. Later that night, as the Pope prepared for Mass below a makeshift canopy of tarps and sticks, Tagle approached him. "Do you notice what they see in you?" he requested. Leo seemed up, sweat clinging to his brow. "No," he stated quietly, "however I'm hoping they see the only who dispatched me." The Mass became unlike any ever televised. The altar turned into a folding table. The chalice became a wood cup. The sound device barely worked. Yet heaven came down with greater strength than in any cathedral. And whilst Pope Leo held up the body of Christ, the whole camp fell to its knees. Many sobbing as they whispered, "He has no longer forgotten us." Over the following months, similar visits followed. In India, he met with families of manual scavengers, washing the fingers of widows ostracized through forged. In Brazil, he prayed in silence with former gang contributors who now ran catechism training inside the favelas. In Japanese Europe, he sat beside Ukrainian and Russian Catholics, sharing a humble meal in a war-ravaged church, reminding them that the church must be a bridge, not a border. Tagle became the quiet architect behind many of those journeys. His information of cultures, his empathy, and his information of the suffering church gave form to what became recognized informally because the wounded pilgrimage. The sector began to take word no longer simply of the visits, however of the message at the back of them. This became a pope who failed to pontificate from afar. He walked with the wounded. He smelled just like the sheep. He cried after they cried. And in doing so, he delivered recuperation that couldn't be explained in coverage files or press releases. Tagle frequently spoke later on to the media, continually downplaying his role and emphasizing the Holy Father's coronary heart. Inside the past, the Pope was a figure to be seen from balconies, he informed one reporter. But now in Pope Leo, the human beings have a shepherd who steps off the balcony and into the dust. Again in Rome, the Pope's method started reworking neighborhood ministry. Dioceses around the sector released their own pilgrimage of presence projects. Neighborhood bishops touring nursing homes, pastors taking walks via slums, seminarians assigned now not simply to parishes but to trauma centers. It became a church at the pass, no longer to unfold have an effect on but to spread recuperation. One night time after sight coming back from an adventure to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Leo and Tagle sat together in the small garden at the back of the papal house. The moon hung low, casting silver mild across the garden stones. "I frequently surprise," Leo said, "what number of wounds Christ nevertheless includes, the ones inflicted now not just at the move, however in the forgotten places we did not reach." Tagle nodded. "And yet he sends us to be his fingers, his voice, even his tears." They sat in silence. Then Leo delivered, "I don't know how long I'll be pope, however as long as I have breath, I need to spend it walking with the wounded." Tagle positioned a hand on his shoulder. "Then might also the sector be ready, due to the fact recovery has come not just from the top of the church, but from its heart." The morning solar had just began to warm the cobblestones of the Vatican courtyard whilst Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped into the personal chapel of the papal house. The scent of incense lingered in the air. Pope Leo XIV became already there, kneeling in silent prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. It had become part of their rhythm, beginning the day now not in conferences or method classes, however in shared silence earlier than the Lord. Nowadays, but, changed into exceptional. It marked exactly 1 year since the conclave. 365 days since Cardinal Tagle, as soon as, the presumed front-runner, had located the fisherman's ring at the hand of any other. 12 months because the church had selected not only a leader, but a route, one which had amazed the arena, and in lots of methods amazed Rome itself. As Leo completed his prayer and stood, he turned to Tagle and smiled. "I used to be considering Peru this morning," he said. "And about Manila," Tagle chuckled softly. "Unusual mixture." "On no account," Leo responded. "Peru gave me my voice. The Philippines gave you your imaginative and prescient. And now both voices and visions are wanted in Rome. They sat collectively within the small papal lawn, birds chirping softly within the bushes above them. The breeze carried with it a light fragrance of roses. Leo's eyes wandered throughout the horizon of rooftops and domes earlier than he spoke once more. Humans nonetheless communicate approximately me as the first American pope, he stated. However, I am now not positive they recognize what that means. Tagle nodded. They think about passports. You suspect of people. Leo looked at him with warm temperature. Exactly. For the sector, Leo turned into American via birth, Peruvian by means of vocation, and Roman through calling. But in truth, he belonged to all and none. His coronary heart beat for people who had no voice, migrant employees, abandoned mothers, youngsters born inside the shadows of conflict. His identification was formed much less by borders than via the gospel, and much less by using nationality than by way of come across. The same become genuine for Tagle. Born in Manila, he had spent a long time navigating East and West, culture and renewal, poverty and theology. His soul bore the laughter of Filipino street companies and the tears of Vatican negotiations. In lots of ways he and Leo were mirrors, distinctive paths, identical route. As the two guys sat reflecting at the year that had exceeded, Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wood crucifix, one he had carried for many years. This, he stated, protecting it lightly, was given to me by using a lady in a Peruvian mountain village. She had lost her husband and 3 youngsters. Seminaries in Europe might duel with the ones in Africa. Bishops from Latin the USA would hold forth retreats in Asia. And most significantly, the Vatican could release a series of listening assemblies in neglected dioceses, locations not often visited, hardly ever heard, however deeply faithful. The initiative became met with each praise and skepticism. Too bold, a few stated, too expensive, said others. But Leo turned into undeterred. We can't have enough money not to pay attention anymore, he insisted. The gospel was in no way meant to be a monologue. It's miles a symphony. Cardinal Tagle changed into positioned in fee of the initiative. He traveled to Vietnam, to Colombia, to South Sudan, and Papua New Guinea, sporting the Pope's message, not as a bureaucrat, but as a brother. And everywhere he went, he repeated the same line. The Pope is being attentive to you, now not because you are a statistic, but due to the fact you are the frame of Christ. In one particularly moving amassing inside the slums of Nairobi, a younger catechist stood and stated, I thought Rome forgot us. Now I know it remembers. Again within the Vatican, Pope Leo watched video footage from these encounters pass due into the night. Sometimes he might call Tagle just to say, tell them I saw them. Inform them I like them. The initiative had every other effect. It began to trade the tradition within the church itself. Younger clergymen began getting to know African drumming strategies for liturgy. Sisters in German convents started out fasting for Filipino flood sufferers. Parishes within the USA commenced praying in Swahili on Pentecost. The church, so often accused of being remote, turned into becoming a circle of relatives once more. One morning, as Leo prepared for a trendy target market, Tagle entered with a brand new document in hand. You won't believe this, he stated, barely containing his joy. In Laos, a group of farmers pulled their wages to buy a small statue of St. Peter. They placed it within the center of their discipline and prayed for you. Leo paused, then whispered, there Peter. Tagle knew what he meant. The faith of the human beings wasn't just worth of notice. It became foundational. On the target market, Pope Leo set aside his prepared speech. Instead, he spoke from the heart. The gospel isn't American, he stated. It isn't Italian. It isn't always even Roman. It's far born in a manger for all. And while we stay love it belongs to our community most effective, we overlook that Christ's fingers stretched across the entire international on that pass. The group became silent. Then he raised the wood crucifix from Peru. This, he stated, became carved by way of a female who misplaced the whole thing. She did no longer ask if the church remembered her. She simply believed. Now we have to don't forget her. And in that moment, the worldwide church glimpsed its coronary heart once more. No longer in Rome on my own, however, within the rice paddies, the favlers, the refugee tents, and mountain chapels. 2 guys, continents, 1 spirit. Tagle and Leo knew the work was simply starting, but in addition they knew the seeds had been planted, and the soil became wealthy. Rain had fallen lightly all night over Rome, washing the metropolis in a hush of reverence. Because the morning solar pierced via the fading clouds, St. Peter's Square glistened like a sea of mild. The Vatican bells rang out, calling the faithful no longer simply to a Sunday Mass, however to something the Church had quietly waited for, imaginative and prescient of the destiny. Inside the sacristy, Pope Leo XIV stood earlier than a small replicate, adjusting the easy white chassel he had worn in South Sudan. He had selected it deliberately, not for its beauty, but for its memory. On the chest turned into a dwindled embroidery of the coolest shepherd, worn threadbare in locations, however it was the garment he had worn while keeping the hand of a deaf toddler, and whilst blessing a camp of forgotten humans. It had grown to be his sign of challenge. Cardinal Tagle entered, his expression calm, wearing a copy of the homily Leo had organized. "Are you certain?" Tagle asked, handing the pages over. Leo smiled lightly. "I used to be certain remaining night, but I won't be analyzing this these days." He placed the typed homily on the table and walked towards the doorway of the basilica. The procession had already all started. A line of altar servers and deacons moving slowly towards the principal altar. But Leo paused at the brink, looking out on the vast crowd accumulated beyond the colonnade. He became to Tagle. State-of-the-art homily won't come from paper. It should come from pain. Tagle nodded. Then communicate from the move. The Mass started out with solemnity. Each gesture steeped in centuries of subculture. Incense rose like a prayer. The Gloria stuffed the rectangular with echoes of wish. But each person became looking ahead to the moment whilst the Pope could speak. Now not just phrases, but course. After the Gospel became sung, Pope Leo progressed. He held no notes, only a small wood crucifix in his hand, the same one given to him via the e-girl in Peru. He stood on the ambo, looked out on the faces before him, pilgrims, clergy, skeptics, the broken and the hopeful, and started out to speak. "My brothers and sisters," he said, voice regular, however packed with quiet fireplace. "The Church has stood for 2,000 years, now not as it become best, however because it became loved." He paused, letting the words settle. "And in every era," Leo persisted, "the destiny of the Church does no longer lie in buildings, titles, or strategies. It lies in folks that carry Christ, not on robes or jewelry, but in their hearts." He held up the crucifix. "This," he stated, "is our only declare. A God who became small, who suffered for us, who rose not to assert vengeance but to provide mercy. He stated a Church that should rediscover its pleasure. That must depart the sacristy and enter the streets. That must be unafraid to appearance negative because it follows a Savior who had nowhere to put his head." After which he became his gaze no longer to the crowd however to the future. "To the younger," he stated, "we need you not to entertain us or to keep us, however to remind us who we're. Ask your questions, undertaking us, bring your fireplace, due to the fact a church without children isn't the body of Christ. It's far a museum." To families, he supplied consolation. To spiritual sisters, he supplied gratitude. To monks, he issued a task. Allow us to now not be managers of sacraments. Allow us to be fathers. Allow us to bleed once they bleed. Have a good time once they return. To bishops, he said with gravity, let us now not fear dropping manage. Let us fear dropping credibility, and then he said what many had hoped a person could ultimately say aloud. The sector isn't always against us. The sector is wounded, and wounded humans lash out, no longer because they hate us, however, due to the fact they hope we might be distinctive. Let us be exceptional. The homily ended no longer with applause, however, with silence. Holy trembling silence. Mass persevered. The Eucharist changed into consecrated. And as the devoted got here ahead to acquire, something uncommon occurred. The Pope stepped down from the altar and gave communion himself to a homeless guy in a wheelchair, a person whom the guards had to start with attempted to move apart. Then to a child with autism who turned into humming softly to himself, then to a group of migrant workers wearing patched jeans and dusty sandals. Each one obtained the body of Christ as though it had been the first time. After the very last blessing, the square remained full. No person desired to leave. That night time, international news outlets declared it a turning factor, a Francis moment, some stated. Others called it a second Pentecost. However, inside the Vatican, amongst people who had served many popes, the sentiment became less complicated. He is the shepherd we didn't expect. One aged manchier whispered to another. However, perhaps he is the one God has waited for. Cardinal Tagle lowered back to his quarters late that evening and determined to be aware on his table. It became handwritten in Pope Leo's familiar script. Luis, nowadays I did not pontificate alone. You have been with me in prayer, in beyond, in prophecy. Thanks for believing within the Church while so many had been geared up to give up. Tomorrow we start once more. Tagle folded the Observe and located it beside his breviary. The next day certainly, the Vatican gardens lay in mild stillness beneath the early morning sky. Mist drifted over the hedges, and the air smelled faintly of cypress and jasmine. Pope Leo XIV had risen before dawn, as became his custom. Nowadays marked exactly 365 days, seeing that his papal inauguration, a quiet milestone, one he had no plans to have a good time with pomp or public address. As a substitute, he stood alone inside the middle of the lawn's labyrinth beneath a circular stone course he had walked in many instances in solitude. This morning, however, he changed into not strolling in meditation. He without a doubt stood there, his eyes closed, arms folded throughout his chest, breathing in deeply the silence earlier than the town stirred. His thoughts drifted to the countless fingers he had held over the last 12 months. The trembling palms of an aged widow in Prague, the tough palms of a fisherman in Manila, the tiny grip of a dying infant in Haiti. Those were no longer pics stored in a folder or published to headlines. These have been encounters engraved on his soul. At the back of him, smooth footsteps approached. It changed into Cardinal Tagle. I figured I'd discover you right here, Tagle stated with a grin. Leo opened his eyes and became. You realize me too nicely. The cardinal exceeded him a folded piece of paper from the secretariat. But he knew that relaxation would now not come quickly. The church changed into stirring. People had been awakening once more to religion, no longer as responsibility, however, as come upon. Later that morning, Leo convened a non-public meeting in the Domus Sancta Martha, now not with heads of kingdom, however with a small institution of those who had modified his first 12 months. A homeless man named Enzo who had once lived close to St. Peter's Rectangular, a younger mother from Syria, an indigenous catechist from the Amazon, a teenager from Canada who had dispatched him a heartfelt letter, and a nun from South Korea who ran a faculty for youngsters with disabilities. There have been no speeches, no protocols, only a round desk, bread, water, and the Pope listening. Enzo referred to finding peace in his struggling. The Syrian mom spoke of choosing to forgive. The youngster shared how his heart again to God through one of the Pope's unscripted homilies. The sister wept quietly, then smiled through her tears. Whilst it came time for Leo to talk, he said handiest this. You've taught me how to be Pope, and extra importantly, a way to be Christian. He embraced each of them earlier than they left, pressing into their hands a small timber pass carved from olive branches grown inside the Vatican garden. That night time, as Rome descended into its usual rustle of vespers and footsteps, the Holy Father walked once more, this time to the chapel of the Crucifix inside St. Peter's Basilica. It changed into empty, store for two candles flickering close to the altar. He knelt on my own. No guards, no aides, no cameras. He whispered a prayer. Lord, I'm most effective a person. However I area this church, your church, lower back into your arms. Let me in no way be inside the way of what you want to do. Behind him, Cardinal Tagle waited silently by means of the doorway, now not looking to interrupt the sacred moment. He knew then, as he watched Leo in prayer, that history could now not don't forget this pope solely for his reforms or travels or speeches. It might keep in mind him for something quieter, something deeper, his presence, his authenticity, his silence that spoke louder than phrases. And as Tagle grew to become to depart, he smiled to himself, realizing something the arena hadn't completely grasped but the greatest homily Pope Leo XIV had ever preached